Christology, Christology is the branch of theology dedicated to the nature of person, purpose, and work of Jesus Christ, who he is as both God and man, and his nature, and the nature, I should say, of his role as the Redeemer. Christology deals with a number of different aspects of Jesus Christ. It deals with his names and his titles. It deals with his nature, both his divine nature and his human nature. It deals with his various states, the eternal state and his temporal state. Deals with his offices as prophet and priest and king. Deals with his words and his works, including, of course, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, his ascension, his session, and everything having to do with the coming of his kingdom. In other words, Christology is the area of focus in theology that centers on the second person of the Trinity, over against a discussion of the Godhead as a whole, what we call theology proper, or of a discussion of the nature of the Father or the Spirit as distinct areas of consideration. It's a branch of theology that deals with the nature of who is the Christ. That's why we call it Christology. Paul had a Christology. In fact, we would say that Paul had an extraordinarily high Christology, a view of the Christ that was high and great. And we gathered this morning under a view of it as we turn in our Bibles to Colossians chapter 1 and we come to verse 15. But before we go to the verses, let me just for a moment consider with you what Paul's view of Christology might have looked like, or more particularly the evolution of his Christology over time. Undoubtedly, prior to his conversion, prior to meeting the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, Paul's view of the Christ, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, Paul's view of the Christ would have been limited to his understanding of the popular view of the Old Testament understanding of Messiah, who was this one who was promised to come. It is highly likely that Paul would have held to, prior to his conversion, the predominant view, popular in Israel, that the seed promised in Genesis 3:15 and the subsequent progressive revelations of that seed, as we talked about even last week, would be of a great man coming to rescue Israel. The predominant view would have been what the Israelites of the first century, what we would call the Jews of the first century, would understand in terms of the Messiah, a great man who would come to rescue Israel. Largely a political view, more than even anything else. But with his conversion, or more specifically with meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul was forced to connect the nature of the Christ to Jesus of Nazareth, because he met Jesus of Nazareth on that road. He was forced to admit now that Jesus was, in fact, the promised one of old, that this Jesus was the seed of Eve who had come not just to free Israel from some sort of oppression, but the one now who had come to fulfill that great ancient promise to crush the hold of sin upon man, which was due to the fall. Now, Paul would have seen the Christ not so much as a political deliverer, but a spiritual one. The purpose of Christ then to be the redeemer from sin rather than a political liberator. But even further beyond that, and I would say this would be following his conversion, moving beyond that first encounter, Paul would come to see the fullness of Jesus as the very Son of God. Even further up the latter from what he understood. He would now be forced to realize that this Jesus was a member of the triune God. Now remember, Paul was monotheistic. He believed that there was only one God, a single unified creator God. But now he would be forced to realize that this God that he had worshiped existed in three distinct persons, in which Jesus is both the Christ, meaning the Messiah, and the Son of God, incarnate, who had come to earth to take the form of a man, grasping a radical revelation that the one true God was, in fact, a singular God by nature, yet revealed to his creation as three distinct, co-equal, divine persons. That's a far leap from what Paul believed prior to his conversion, believe me. And not only that, but Paul would have to come to see him as the one who identified himself as Jesus. Remember in Acts chapter 9? What does Jesus say to him? Who are you, Lord? Paul asks. And what does Jesus say? He says, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. And so he would not only have to see Jesus as part of the divine Godhead, but also see him as the one who bore the glory of Yahweh. In fact, in Acts 26:13, where Paul is recounting his conversion, he says that this Jesus appeared to him brighter than the sun. In other words, greater than any physical manifestation possible. I mean, what's the brightest thing we have? The sun. Thus, I would say that this understanding of Jesus, this Christology, would mark Paul's theology going forward. He would presume this view of both the Godhead and Jesus the Christ in all of his writings. Paul would make this understanding of Jesus the heartbeat of his gospel, of his mission work, of his evangelism, of his church planting, of his correspondence, of his discipleship, of his worldview, and on and on and on it would go. Paul would make that understanding of Jesus the very heart of all that he believed, all that he did, all that he said, etc., etc. And so what we have here, starting in verse 15 of Paul's letter to the Colossians, is Paul taking this view of Christ Jesus and applying it to the struggles the Colossian church was having in relationship to those who wanted to twist the gospel of Christ. That's what he's going to do. He's going to take his view of Christ, his view of Jesus, who this man is, who this divine one is, and apply it to the Colossians. In a strange sort of way, Paul is going to answer the question, what do we do about these false teachers, by saying, he is Jesus. I would argue that Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20 is one of the greatest Christological passages in the New Testament. I would put it on level par with passages like John 1, 1 to 18. I would put it on par with Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. I would put it on par with Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 14. And even many others where Paul himself explains the nature of Jesus, for example, in Acts chapter 13. This is one of the greatest Christological passages that we will see. And structurally, it has a very simple outline. Structurally, it's a very simple outline. Paul is going to begin with a profound statement of the nature of Jesus as the image of God. He's going to turn then to the position of Jesus as the creator and sustainer of all things. And then he's going to end with the work of Jesus as the reconciler of all things back to himself. He is the very image of God and is the creator of all things and is the one redeeming all things back to himself. that simple. Today, we're going to deal with just the first of those three elements, the profound statement of the nature of Jesus. Now, fair warning, today's discussion will be a bit complex, but Christology ain't easy. So hopefully I can make this understandable. Now, let's just read verse 15, all right? The first part of this, the very first element. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Now, don't miss that. That is one of the most profound statements that you will find in literature anywhere. But we must ask a question even as we enter the paragraph, and that is, who is the he that is spoken of at the beginning of the verse? Who is the he? The underlying Greek phrase is hos emai. Hos emai. It is a pronoun in the singular masculine form, thus translated he is. Now, the assumption that we make, of course, is that Paul is speaking of Jesus here, right? Now, we do that reflexively because we who have studied the scriptures a long time, we just sort of do that. We just sort of assume that Paul is referring to Jesus. But I'll have you notice that nowhere in verses 15 to 20 does Paul ever actually use the name of Jesus. He never does. So it is an assumption that Paul is speaking of Jesus. In this case, the third person masculine version of this this pronoun, is similar to another pronoun, which is in the first person singular, and that would be the Greek phrase ego eimi, or translated in English, I am. You see the parallel? He is third person, I am first person. Okay, same basic construct. It is a favorite phrase of Jesus, particularly in the fourth gospel, particularly in the Gospel of John. Jesus uses it, you remember, most, what's the word I'm looking for? Most pronounced in John chapter 8, verse 58, when he says, before Abraham was, I am, right? And of course, we recognize the connection that Jesus is making of himself to the great I am clause in the book of Exodus, where God identifies himself as the I am statement, what we call the tetragrammaton, the phrase that ultimately becomes the word Yahweh, I am that I am. Jesus uses this phrase ego eimi a number of times in the gospel accounts. I am the good shepherd, I am the door of the sheep, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and so on. There are, I think, about a dozen of them that are pronounced in the Gospel of John. But it's interesting that Jesus uses this exact same phrase when he meets with Paul on the road to Damascus, as I alluded to earlier. What does Jesus say? I am Jesus. I am the one whom you persecute. In other words, can we prove that Paul is referring to Jesus based on the context we have in this passage? Can we do exegesis, which is to look at the paragraph and ask ourselves that exegetical question, who is he referring to, and answer it faithfully with Jesus? And I guess a follow-up question would be, do we need to? Well, the fact that I've wandered down this path would seem to indicate, yep, we need to. I think it is important to fully clarify Paul referring to Jesus of Nazareth here. Paul referring to the crucified and risen carpenter, whom Paul had witnessed in his divine glory, upon whom the gospel was founded, and the faith of the Colossians was based. Okay, don't miss this. Paul is referring to Jesus here not just because it's some sort of tangential idea that he wants to get across. Nope. He is making it clear that the faith of the church is based upon this one. And so he's identifying him. Now, I would answer my question, do we need to do this? And can we prove that Paul is, in fact, referring to Jesus? I think we can answer yes. Both the context and the content clearly assert, strongly assert, that Paul is speaking here of Jesus, the God-man. So we're going to take a little look at what we have here. Contextually, the antecedent of this pronoun, he, would certainly be in the previous verses. We would need to go backwards, right? If you just take a pronoun and throw it, you're looking for some answer. So you go back to the previous two verses. Verse 13. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is. All right, so the antecedent of this word appears to be the beloved Son of verse 13. That would just be common and logical in rhetoric. The he in that. Now, the problem is that there's a he in that verse also. You look at the beginning of verse 13. He has delivered us. All right, so who's the he of that verse? So we have to back up and look back at verse 12, and we see, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light, he has delivered us. So the he is undoubtedly referring to the Father in the previous verse. The Father has delivered us. That is, he's delivered us as believers from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his Son. See the order there? He has promised us, he has delivered us, and he's delivered us to his Son, and then his Son becomes the object of the he in this verse. Now, let me also observe something that should be quite obvious to Sean standing back there in the back. Okay? The ontological nature of a father assumes the reality of a son, doesn't it? Or a child. I point to Sean because he's holding one on his front right now, standing in the back, looking at me. He's a father. Why? Because he has kids. Okay? The ontological nature of a father is one who has children. One is a father only when he has a child. Now, in this case, Paul is referring to a male child, but does it matter? So we have to step back and we have to consider this from a Trinitarian perspective. We have to go back to Paul's Christology, which is Trinitarian in nature, as I said earlier. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 5, the writer quotes Psalm 2:7 to reveal that the Son of God is begotten of the Father. The phrase begotten means coming forth from. They beget. I mean, the old King James versions of some of the genealogies, so-and-so beget so-and-so who beget so-and-so who beget so-and-so. It's the same word, begotten, coming forth from, a child coming forth from his father. Thus, the second person of the Trinity, as we see, referred to as the Son, his beloved Son, verse 13, comes forth ontologically, decretively, and eternally from the first person of the Trinity. Now, all of those three words may scare you. What do you say? What? Decretively, ontologically, eternally? Let me make it simple for you. It means this. The Son is of the same nature as the Father. He comes from the Father because he possesses the same nature as the Father. So he's begotten of the Father in the sense that he is of the same substance and nature as the Father. And he is also begotten of the Father because he comes with the same purposes and plans as the Father. If you possess the same nature, then you possess the same thoughts, which means you have the same purpose and plan. So the Son comes out from the Father, possessing the nature of Yahweh, having the intention to do what he, the Father, or the whole of the Godhead, has decreed. Yet being eternally distinct from the Father as a person. So the Son comes forth decretively. I have begotten you. The Father decrees the Son. And all of what the Father decrees comes into the Son. He is ontologically from the Father, and that he proceeds from the Father, and he is eternally from the Father. Now, let me just summarize that in very simple terms. This is hard. But in eternity past, the Son came forth from the Father, yet the Son has always existed, distinct from the Father. Now, don't ask me to explain that, because no human being can. It is an operation within the nature of the Trinity, within the nature of the Godhead, that the Father begat the Son, yet the Son has always been. We simply have to accept those two seemingly contradictory, but I would dare call them paradoxical statements. They're both true. So the Father begat the Son. So given Paul's understanding of Jehovah as a singular God, yet having met one of the divine persons, Paul now speaks of Jehovah with this distinction of personhood. As I said at the beginning, what was part of Paul's Christology is that he had to come to realize that Yahweh was not one being, one person. Now he's come to realize Yahweh is one being, three persons. Now again, is there a parallel in human history to that? None have ever been found. Because there are no things in this world that exist as one thing and three things at the same time. They've tried several analogies, but they simply don't work, right? You take an egg, you have a shell, a yolk, and a white, and they're all an egg. But they're not all the same thing. They're different. You can break them apart and separate them. But the Godhead is three distinct things, but yet it's not this. It's one nature. The Godhead is of one nature, but there are three distinct persons bearing forth from it. Again, another Christian paradox we simply cannot explain in this materialistic world. But Paul has come to understand this truth. He's been forced to face it now as he has met this Christ. Thus, the Son becomes the focus of the pronouns to follow. He, the Son of the Father, is the image of the invisible God and the firstborn of all creation. Okay, so you could retranslate this as the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, if you want to substitute the word Son in here. But you'll notice Paul doesn't do that. He leaves some room here. Because we have to ask, how does the Son translate into a reference to the man Jesus? That's a logical question. He's made a reference to the Son. He, the Son, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. We would look at that and go, okay, that makes sense to us. But how can we know that Paul is actually referring to the man, Jesus, and equating him as the Son of God? Which would appear obvious that that's what he's doing, don't you think? Let me offer you three reasons why it is obvious that Paul is referring to the man Jesus when he speaks of he, even though he calls him the Son. If you go all the way back to verse 3 of this letter, Paul has already identified the Son as Jesus. We always thank God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So he's already connected the Father and the Son together by identifying him not in that verse as the Son, but rather as the person Jesus Christ. The assumption to follow then is that the terms Son from Father and Jesus are synonymous, because Paul makes them synonymous earlier. But a second reason is that Paul makes this he, the Son, both the image of the invisible God, meaning as a member of divinity, and firstborn of creation, implying that he's a member of the created world. A point he's going to flesh out through the rest of the paragraph. We'll come back to it in a second. But there is a third. There is a third. And it's one that's often overlooked in the discussion of how we know this. You will notice down in verse 20 that Paul refers to the blood of his cross. The blood of his cross. The pronoun his, in this case, being equal to all the he pronouns along the way in verses 15 to 20. Implying that the one who was the image of God in verse 15 had a cross in verse 20. So who would that be? And the obvious conclusion is that this is the human being, Jesus, who had died on a cross. I mean, who else would Paul be referring to having a cross? Paul wouldn't care about anybody else having a cross but one particular individual. So Paul asserts here, by clear and obvious implication, as well as exegetical reality, that Jesus is the one he's about to discuss. This Christological passage is a study in the nature, person, purpose, and work of Jesus, the God-man. Jesus, the Son of God, and the Son of Man. That's who he's referring to. Again, you might say, well, that 5 to 10 minutes of argument is really rather obvious, isn't it? Yeah, it is, but don't overlook it, okay? And there's some reasons why you'll see as we move along. Now, Paul describes this he as in two distinct ways in this verse. Number one, he is the image of the invisible God, and number two, he's the firstborn of all creation. He is both simultaneously. This word image of the invisible God, image, is a word that means likeness or representation. Quite literally, it means possessing the same form. An image. This term is used in a variety of ways throughout the New Testament to convey the idea of carrying the nature of something else. Carrying the nature of something else. I'll give you a few examples. Romans chapter 1, verse 23. Paul says that fallen man takes images of created things and substitutes them for the glory of God. He forms images, likenesses of God, and worships them. Takes likenesses of God and worships them rather than God himself. Now, we would call those idols, but Paul uses the word images. Man creates a likeness of how he views God and puts it into some sort of physical thing. In 1 Corinthians 15:49, human beings are said to carry the fallen human beings that carry the image of Adam, the man of dust. We bear his image. We're men of dust. We will die and fall back to the dust of the ground. In contrast, Paul says, to believers carrying the image of Christ, who is the man of heaven. An image, on the one hand, we belong to Adam by virtue of our humanity, but we belong to Christ, or we bear his image by virtue of being born again by the Spirit of God. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 29, the justified in Christ are predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son of God, sanctified to be like our elder brother, who is the firstborn among many brothers. Don't pass over that phrase. It's going to become important in the second half of this verse. The image. We are being sanctified by the Spirit, Paul argues, into the very image of Christ himself, so that we bear the fullness of who he is. See the picture that's being painted here? The picture of images, carrying something, bearing and representing the image of something else. In 1 Corinthians 11:7, man carrying the image and glory of God, having been created by God directly. We bear the imago Dei, the image of God. We possess in ourselves an image. We are representing something. That's the idea here. In this case, the term conveys that Jesus, the God-man, carries fully in himself the image of divinity, the likeness of divinity, the representation of divinity. He is the image of the invisible God. Now, you remember, as we've already noted, that Paul has described Jesus as the Son of God, right? Already seen that. So we've already argued that Paul understands Jesus to be the very Son of God himself. A term which Paul understands, obviously, to represent the fullness of deity. As I said, the one coming forth from the Father, bearing the image of the Father. In fact, it's interesting that the devil himself questions this title of Jesus when he tempts him in Matthew chapter 4. If you really are the Son of God, he says, multiple times in those testings. The devil questions this title of Jesus, but asserts, if you watch it closely by implication, that Jesus can be the divine one But the devil says you can be the divine one if you do these things. Demonstrate that you are the Son of God by turning these stones into loaves of bread. And Jesus simply says, I'm not going to do that. Now, we assume that he says he's not going to do that because he doesn't need to do that. But let me tell you that the greater implication is that Jesus doesn't turn the stones into bread because he says, I'm not playing your little game. I am the Son of God. You might question who I am, but I know who I am, and I'm not going to turn these stones into bread to prove you right. Because I don't need to prove that. It already is. See? In fact, the demons in the Gadarene tombs in Matthew chapter 8 recognized Jesus with the same title. What do you have to do with us, Son of God? Have you come to torment us before the appointed time? What are they admitting? They're admitting that Jesus had the power to torment them before the time. They recognized that he had the authority to torment them, to judge them, to punish them, to cast them off. They knew that. In fact, I would point out that contrary to liberal myth, which is prevalent in much of liberal Christianity, that contrary to liberal myth, Jesus did claim this title for himself, Son of God, many times. John 3:18, 5:25, 10:36, 11:4. In fact, the entire Gospel of John is built on the premise that Jesus was the Son of God and said it multiple times. In fact, the Jewish leadership recognized that he had called himself that in John chapter 19, verse 7. They knew what he claimed. They knew what he claimed. So when this term is used, Son of God, it's connected to Jesus carrying fully in himself the nature of divinity. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the likeness of the invisible God. He is the representation of the fullness of who God is. Just as you and I bear the image of God in the Imago Dei, which God has given to us, he bears an even greater Imago Dei because he bears the fullness of God. You see, there are communicable attributes that come to us from God, but there are incommunicable attributes that cannot come to us, but they could to him because he bore them. Jesus bears the fullness of the Imago Dei, the fullness of the image of the invisible God. This word invisible meaning that which is not ordinarily visible, but has been manifested in reality. The incarnation of the Son of God into human flesh makes visible what would ordinarily be invisible. He is the image of the invisible God. He makes known to us what is invisible. He brings to us the fullness of the picture of God. We can look at him and go, oh, that's God. Paul asserts Jesus bears the fullness of deity. That he is the Son of God, making visible to us the nature of Yahweh. And that he's doing so to a race that cannot see him due to something inherent in them, particularly their fallen nature. Did Adam see God in the garden? Yes, he did. He walked with God, he talked with God. Being cast from the garden and banished thereof is symbolic of man now being left without direct, visible knowledge of God. But the Christ comes to do what? To bring the fullness of God back to us, that we might see him. What does he say to his disciples? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So Paul's asserting here that Jesus is the fullness of deity, the image of the invisible God. Paul's Christology is a high Christology. He believes that Jesus is fully and completely and utterly God. But then he says he's also the firstborn of all creation. And this is where the struggle session starts. This word firstborn in this verse is the word protatokos. I said that slowly because I want to get it right. Prototokos. Prototokos. Proto meaning first, like a prototype, right? The first of a thing. Proto, the second part, tokos, meaning child or offspring or birthed one. It's similar as ego eimi is to hos eimi in this sense to a word theotokos. You may not be familiar with that because you're not Eastern Christians, but Eastern Orthodoxy is heavy into the Theotokos, which is a title ascribed to Mary, who is the mother of God, the one who brings forth God. They call her the mother of God. She is the God bearer. She is the Theotokos, child of God, bringer of God. This is prototokos. This is a word which has various meanings depending on context. All right? So this is where the struggle session begins. Which of these words, which of these contexts should we look for? Okay? Because the first and obvious definition of this word means the first child born to a mother. In fact, this same word is used to describe Jesus in Luke chapter 2, verse 7. And she brought forth her firstborn and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger. Right? Clearly, Jesus is the first child born to Mary. So he would be the firstborn son of Mary, which, by the way, is interesting because our Catholic friends want to insist that Jesus never had any other children. I'm sorry, Mary never had any other children. Why call him firstborn then? Okay, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't call the only child a firstborn child. It's the same reason we don't call Pope Francis the First. He's simply Pope Francis. He'll be Pope Francis the First if there's a Pope Francis the Second. So this word can mean the firstborn, and this is where the problem lies. A lot of people want to latch on to that definition. Okay, yeah, this is the firstborn of creation. A second definition, however, is the one to possess the double inheritance, the birthright, due to being firstborn. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 17, God says, give a double portion to the firstborn child. I remind my sister of this often, that I am the firstborn, therefore, doesn't really fly with her, but in the covenant, in the Mosaic law, the firstborn child was to receive a double inheritance because he was to carry on the family legacy. He was to carry on the family name. He was responsible for the family when the father died. He was the one to carry it on, which may be a reason why Jesus waited until he was almost 30 years old to begin his public ministry. He may have been waiting for Joseph to die so that he could then take on his public ministry. Can't prove that, but that's one theory that's been expressed. He is in a special place because he has an inheritance by virtue of his position. So yes, he's the firstborn literally of the family, but he is, in a greater sense, the one who's to receive the legacy of the family coming from the father. So you see it's moving up a notch. But then there's a third use of this word, even higher than that. And this word means one who is preeminent. One is preeminent, the first to come forth, in a sense. In verse 18, it says, and he is the head of the body of the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. See, the same word is used there. The firstborn, the first one to come forth. And the implication of the verse, as we'll see later when we get to it, is that Jesus is the first to come forth, and therefore the first in preeminence amongst all the others. There are brothers, firstborn, but he's preeminent. Now, the logic is still similar to the previous definition I gave. The firstborn son gets a double inheritance because he's considered preeminent amongst the others. But this goes even one step further. He's preeminent among many brothers. So it is likely that Paul is using the term in that final sense, that Jesus is the one who is superior. He possesses a superiority to all other things. And what seems reasonable, as we'll see the way the paragraph unfolds, is that Jesus is not only the Son of the Father, but he is also the greatest human being ever to live. The single greatest human that ever walked planet Earth. We would call him the firstborn of God himself, given the birthright by the Father, and thus preeminent amongst all others in becoming a man. In becoming a man. How did the Son gain this preeminence? And the answer is, he gained this preeminence by entering into this world. He is the firstborn of all creation. Now, the elephant in the room here is this. This is contra the Arian heresy that Jesus was only a man and that he was deified in some way during the course of his life. By the way, Jehovah's Witnesses are still carrying the ancient Arian heresy that was taken care of years ago. It's the heretical assertion that Jesus was the Son of God only in an indirect way. They would look at this verse and say, well, see, he's the firstborn of creation, so he's a created one who was deified in some way by the Father. Deified in some way. Not the pre-existing one who entered into the creation, but one that was formed from creation. Now, that particular position, by the way, was refuted at Nicaea in 325 and in Constantinople in 383 by arguing that Jesus is homoousios with the Father, meaning of the same substance, being uncreated, possessing the same nature as the Father, etc., etc. He came forth from the Father in eternity past as the Son, and then entered into his creation as the Son of God now in flesh. And Paul will clearly refute the Arian position in the very next verse, which we'll get to next week, Lord willing. So by entering into humanity, which, by the way, don't forget, humanity is the pinnacle of God's creation. What's the most important thing God created? The man from the dust of the ground, and then the wife from him, right? God didn't create this world so animals could have control of it. No. He didn't create this world so angels could have control of it. No. He created this world that man would have dominion over it. Man is the pinnacle of God's creation, so thus when the Son of God, enters into this world, he is coming to be the greatest human ever to live. So he is the image of the invisible God, possessing the fullness of the nature of God himself, on the one hand, and yet at the same time also being the firstborn, preeminent amongst all of creation. Paul is asserting here that Jesus is the greatest of all creation. By entering into this world as the divine Son of God, robing himself in flesh, Jesus is seen to be the firstborn in every sense. The firstborn of the Father, literally, as the Son, the firstborn who gets the double inheritance by virtue of his obedience, and the firstborn of his position as preeminent amongst all the others by virtue of being the Son of God in flesh. See it? Those who want to limit Paul's phraseology here to just some sort of begetting in human flesh have missed the point of how that word is actually being used throughout the totality of Scripture. In other words, Jesus as the God-man. Fully God and fully man in every sense. Fully the one that's the image of the invisible God, and fully the firstborn of all creation. The very essence of the Christian claim about the nature of Jesus, the Son of God, born into the perfect human nature. You see what Paul did here in this verse? He declared the highest possible Christology. Jesus, the crucified carpenter from Nazareth who rose from the dead, is in every way the fullness of Yahweh and the greatest of mankind. That's a high Christology. Seeing Jesus as the fullness of Yahweh in every sense, and at the same time, the fullness of what it means to be human. The greatest of the greatest of God, and the greatest of man. That's a high Christology. And Paul is going to base the entirety of the rest of this letter on that phrase. He's already told us what his thesis is, in that he has delivered us. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. But why? Because his beloved Son is the greatest. There is nothing greater than him. We come this morning then to the celebration of the Lord's Supper. And it is easy for us and typical for us to look upon these elements and this particular rite, R-I-T-E, and think about primarily what it is that Jesus did, right? We look at the elements, we see the bread, we see the cup, and we equate the bread, of course, to the broken body of Jesus. He lived out a perfect human life and then gave his body over to be crucified. And then we look at the drink and we say, well, that's the blood of Christ, and it represents what he did on the cross, shedding his blood for us. That's excellent. Nothing wrong with that at all. We'll not refute that. But is that all that we consider at the table? Is it possible for us, rather, to come to the table, instead of reflecting on what he's done, to reflect on who he is? Notice the phrase on the front of the table. Do this in remembrance of what I have done. Doesn't it say that? It doesn't say that, does it? What does it say? Do this in remembrance of me. And the implication, I think, of that phrase is that what Jesus truly wants his disciples and generations to follow him in this ritual, what he wants his disciples to do, not just remember what he did or even what he said, but much more importantly, who he was, or dare I say, who he is, ontologically, decretively, principally. He is the one who came down from heaven as the very essence of God himself, and he is the one who is the firstborn of all creation. When we come to the bread, we certainly think of the fact that his body was broken on the tree, but would it not also be a moment for us to reflect on the fact that Yahweh entered into human flesh, that this bread represents the fact that he was the firstborn of all creation? The greatest human that ever walked this planet? We remember that. And then secondly, when we look at the cup and we think of the blood of Christ, could we not in fact see that as a reminder to us that this one who came also went into the presence of God himself and brought his own blood into that place? And who can go there? Who can go into that place? I mean, they had to tie a rope around the leg of the chief priest whenever he went into the Holy of Holies to make sure that if he died in that place, they could pull him out. But that's not true of Christ. Why? Because he is fully the Son of God, able to take his own perfect blood and go into the presence of the Father in a perfect tabernacle and offer it to him without reservation or hesitation of any kind. You see? We can remember what it is that Jesus did, certainly. But we can also come to this table and consider much more important thing, which is who he really was. Because let me suggest, if I dare be so bold, that what he did doesn't mean a thing unless we believe in who he was. Unless we embrace that he is fully the divine one that comes down from the Father, the Son of God, and who is the firstborn of all creation, the greatest of all humans. Because without both God and man in him, there is no atonement.